Eleanor Patterson's trembling fingers stopped mid-touch against her neck, the morning coffee cup slipping from her other hand to shatter across the kitchen floor. The small mass beneath her weathered skin pulsed with what felt like its own heartbeat. This wasn't just a swollen gland. Something was moving inside her. Frank's heavy footsteps thundered down the stairs as the ceramic shards scattered like broken promises across their 40-year-old linoleum. His face went alabaster white when he saw his wife frozen by the sink, one hand pressed to her throat, the other clutching the counter until her knuckles matched the October frost outside their Nashville window. "Ellie, what?" His voice cracked like kindling, remembering how her mother had stood in this same spot 60 years ago, touching the same place on her neck just weeks before they lost her. "Call Dr. Peterson," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible above the grandfather clock's relentless ticking. Call him now. What had been growing inside her all these years, and why was it suddenly fighting to get out? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Eleanor had always believed that home was where love lived in the smallest details. Frank's coffee mug with the chipped handle that he refused to replace, the wooden kitchen table he'd built with his own calloused hands 43 years ago, and the wall of family photographs that chronicled 4 decades of birthday parties, graduations, and quiet Sunday afternoons. At 62, she had earned every gray strand in her auburn hair and every laugh line around her green eyes through a life dedicated to nurturing others. For 38 years, she had shaped young minds in Mrs. Patterson's kindergarten classroom at Hillcrest Elementary, where generations of Nashville children learned to tie their shoes and sound out their first words under her patient guidance. "Every child is a seed waiting to bloom," she would tell new teachers, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had witnessed countless small miracles. Her own 3 children, Michael, Sarah, and David, had grown into fine adults who called every Sunday and filled her world with 6 precious grandchildren who thought their grandma, Ellie, hung the moon. Frank Patterson, her husband of 4 decades, remained her steady anchor in a world that seemed to spin faster each year. At 65, his carpenter's hands were more weathered but no less gentle when they held hers during their evening walks through their quiet Bellevue neighborhood. He still woke before dawn to brew her coffee exactly the way she liked it, 2 sugars, a splash of cream, and left it warming on the counter with a folded paper napkin that served as her personalized placemat. "Measure twice, cut once," he'd say about everything from hanging pictures to planning vacations, a philosophy that had guided their methodical, comfortable life. Their 2-story brick home on Maple Street stood as testament to Frank's craftsmanship and Eleanor's eye for making any space feel like a warm embrace. The wraparound porch held 2 weathered rocking chairs where they spent summer evenings watching neighbors tend their gardens and children ride bicycles in lazy circles. Inside, every room told the story of their journey together. Michael's high school football trophies sharing shelf space with Sarah's honor roll certificates. David's art projects from elementary school still magneted to the refrigerator beside crayon drawings from their grandchildren. Recently retired from teaching, Eleanor had looked forward to spending her golden years reading novels in her favorite armchair by the living room window, tending to her prize-winning rose garden, and spoiling her grandchildren with homemade chocolate chip cookies and stories about their parents' childhood adventures. She and Frank had modest retirement savings supplemented by Social Security and Medicare, enough to live comfortably if they remained careful with their spending. But this morning felt different. The routine comfort of their predictable life had been shattered by something she couldn't explain, something that made her question everything she thought she knew about her own body. As Frank helped sweep up the broken coffee cup, his worried eyes searching her face for answers she didn't have, Eleanor felt the first tremors of fear that their carefully constructed world was about to change forever. The discovery had been growing quietly for 3 weeks, like a secret Eleanor's body kept from her conscious mind, It began during her recovery from the autumn flu that had knocked her flat for nearly a week in late September. While toweling off after her first real shower in days, her fingers had brushed against something unfamiliar on the left side of her neck. A small, firm mass about the size of a marble that seemed to shift slightly when she pressed against it. "Probably just a swollen lymph node," she had whispered to her reflection, remembering how Dr. Peterson had explained such things during her grandchildren's various childhood illnesses. "Nothing more than my body fighting off the last of that nasty bug." But even as she spoke the words aloud, trying to convince herself, a deeper instinct whispered that something wasn't quite right. Over the following days, Eleanor found herself unconsciously touching the spot during routine activities, while grading the last of her teaching materials she was donating to the school, while kneading dough for Frank's favorite dinner rolls, while reading bedtime stories to 4-year-old Emma during their weekly sleepover. Each time, the mass seemed slightly different, sometimes softer, sometimes more pronounced, as if it were responding to her attention in ways that defied her understanding. The really unsettling part was how it seemed to pulse occasionally with what felt almost like a separate heartbeat. Eleanor would lie awake at night, Frank snoring peacefully beside her, pressing her fingertips against the spot and counting 1, 2, 3, trying to determine if the rhythm matched her own pulse or followed some independent pattern. During those dark, quiet hours, childhood fears would creep back like shadows, memories of her mother's final illness that had started with similar mysterious symptoms. This morning's episode in the kitchen had been the breaking point. While preparing Frank's coffee, their sacred morning ritual, Eleanor had felt the mass move distinctly, almost like something turning over inside her neck. The sensation was so startling, so fundamentally wrong, that her body had reacted before her mind could process what was happening. Frank had swept up the broken ceramic with his usual methodical care, but Eleanor could see the worry lines deepening around his eyes as he stole glances at her. They had been married long enough for him to recognize when she was holding back information, and she knew he was giving her space to explain in her own time. That was Frank's way. Patient, steady, waiting for her to find the words. "Tom Peterson's office," came the familiar voice of Mary Henderson, the receptionist who had scheduled appointments for 3 generations of Nashville families. "Mary, it's Eleanor Patterson. I was wondering if I could speak with Dr. Peterson about, well, I've found something that's concerning me." Eleanor's voice sounded steadier than she felt, a skill developed through decades of remaining calm for frightened kindergartners. There was a pause that lasted a heartbeat too long. "Eleanor, honey, what kind of something are we talking about?" Mary's voice shifted into the careful neutrality she reserved for potentially serious calls. "It's a lump on my neck. I've been watching it for a few weeks, but this morning it seemed to move." The words felt strange, leaving her lips, as if speaking them aloud made the situation more real and more frightening. "Can you come in this afternoon, Dr. Peterson had a cancellation at 2:30. Eleanor glanced at Frank, who was listening while pretending to read yesterday's newspaper. "That seems quite soon. Is everything—" "Eleanor." Mary's voice became gently firm, the tone she used when delivering news that families needed to hear but didn't want to accept. "When someone your age calls about a neck mass, we don't wait 2:30 today. Don't eat anything after noon, just in case." Just in case of what? The question hung unspoken in the air as Eleanor agreed to the appointment and hung up the phone. Frank folded his newspaper with deliberate precision, the way he approached any task that required his full attention. "I'm driving you," he said, not making it a question. "Frank, it's probably nothing. You don't need to—" "Ellie!" His voice carried 40 years of gentle authority. "We've been through everything else together. We're not stopping now." As they prepared for the doctor's appointment, Eleanor found herself moving through their home with heightened awareness, noticing details she typically took for granted, the way afternoon light filtered through their bedroom curtains, the sound of Frank humming while he searched for his good shoes, the familiar weight of her wedding ring as she twisted it nervously around her finger. Everything felt simultaneously precious and fragile, as if the normal world might disappear if she didn't pay careful attention to preserving it in her memory. By 1:30, they were sitting in Frank's pickup truck, driving toward answers neither of them was prepared to hear. Dr. Thomas Peterson's office had been a fixture in Eleanor's life for over 2 decades, a place where she had brought her children for scraped knees and strep throat, where she and Frank had received reassuring news about minor ailments and aging bodies. The familiar waiting room, with its outdated magazines and cheerful watercolor paintings of Tennessee landscapes, usually felt like an extension of their neighborhood community. Today, however, the space seemed charged with an undercurrent of tension that Eleanor couldn't shake. Eleanor Patterson? The voice belonged to Jenny Martinez, Dr. Peterson's nurse practitioner, whose usual warm smile seemed slightly strained around the edges. Eleanor had known Jenny since she was a freckle-faced third grader in her classroom 15 years ago, and the young woman's careful professional demeanor felt unusually formal. Frank squeezed Eleanor's hand as they stood together. "Want me to come back with you?" he asked, his voice carrying the protective tone that had emerged whenever Eleanor faced anything potentially troubling throughout their marriage. "Not yet," Eleanor replied, though she appreciated his steadiness. "Let me talk to Tom first, see what he thinks." Dr. Peterson's examination room felt smaller than Eleanor remembered, perhaps because of the gravity that seemed to fill every corner as the elderly physician conducted his assessment. Tom Peterson had delivered all 3 of Eleanor's children and had been Frank's fishing buddy for nearly 3 decades. His hands, weathered but still gentle, moved with practiced efficiency as he palpated the mass on Eleanor's neck. The silence stretched longer than it should have. Eleanor watched Dr. Peterson's face, reading the subtle changes in his expression that 40 years of friendship had taught her to recognize. His eyebrows drew together in concentration, then concern, then something that looked uncomfortably like surprise. "Eleanor," he said finally, settling back in his chair with the deliberate movement of someone choosing his words carefully. "How long did you say you've noticed this?" "About 3 weeks, maybe a little longer. It started after I had that flu bug that was going around." Eleanor's voice remained steady, but she could feel her heart rate increasing. "Tom, you're making me nervous with that look." Dr. Peterson managed a reassuring smile, but Eleanor could see through it to the worry underneath. "I want you to see someone today, Eleanor. Dr. Sarah Mitchell over at Mercy General. She's young, but she's very good with unusual presentations." The word unusual hung in the air like smoke from a fire that hadn't been contained yet. Eleanor felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Unusual how?" "It's probably nothing serious, Doctor," Peterson said, but Eleanor noticed he avoided making direct eye contact while speaking. "But this mass has some characteristics that I'd like a specialist to evaluate. Dr. Mitchell can do some imaging, get a better look at what we're dealing with." Eleanor had heard this careful, measured tone before during her mother's illness 6 decades ago, when doctors spoke in gentle euphemisms while delivering news that would change everything. "Tom, you've known me since I was 35 years old. Don't treat me like a child who needs to be protected from the truth." Dr. Peterson's shoulders sagged slightly, and for a moment he looked every one of his 73 years. "Eleanor, I've been practicing medicine for 45 years, and I've never felt anything quite like what I'm feeling in your neck. It's not behaving like a typical lymph node or cyst. There's movement that doesn't make sense, and the texture is—" He paused, searching for words. "It's unlike anything in my experience." The admission hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Tom Peterson was not a man given to dramatic statements or uncertainty. His reputation had been built on steady, reliable diagnoses delivered with confidence earned through decades of treating Nashville families. If something was beyond his considerable experience, it was serious indeed. "What kind of movement?" Eleanor asked, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. "It seems to respond to pressure in ways that suggest it might be connected to other systems. I want Dr. Mitchell to do an ultrasound, maybe a CT scan, today if possible." Eleanor felt the room tilt slightly, the way it had when she'd received the phone call about her parents' accident so many years ago. The normal world was shifting, revealing cracks in the foundation of everything she had assumed about her body, her health, her future. "I'll call Frank in," she said quietly. When Frank entered the examination room, his eyes immediately went to Eleanor's face, reading the fear she was trying to hide. 40 years of marriage had given him an encyclopedic knowledge of her expressions, and he moved to her side without being asked. Dr. Peterson repeated his explanation for Frank's benefit, using slightly more technical language but maintaining the same careful tone. Eleanor watched her husband's face process the information, saw his jaw tighten and his protective instincts engage. "What are we looking at in terms of timing?" Frank asked, his carpenter's mind immediately focusing on practical details. "And what should we expect?" "I've already called ahead to Mercy General. Dr. Mitchell can see Eleanor this afternoon if you can get there by 4 o'clock. They'll do whatever imaging is necessary, and we should have some answers by tomorrow morning." The drive across Nashville to Mercy General Hospital passed in relative silence, both Eleanor and Frank lost in their own thoughts. Eleanor found herself noticing details with unusual clarity, the way autumn sunlight slanted through the truck's windshield, the familiar landmarks of their city passing by like a slideshow of their shared life, the gentle vibration of the mass in her neck that seemed to pulse in rhythm with her increasingly rapid heartbeat. As they pulled into the hospital parking garage, Eleanor reached across the truck's bench seat to take Frank's hand. "Whatever this is," she said softly, "we'll face it together." Frank's response was to lift her hand to his lips and kiss her knuckles gently. "Always have, always will," he replied, words that had become their personal vow renewed daily through 4 decades of keeping that promise. Mercy General Hospital's emergency department buzzed with the controlled chaos that Eleanor had witnessed during Frank's heart attack scare 3 years earlier, but today she was experiencing it from the other side, as the patient rather than the worried family member. The registration process felt surreal, her own voice sounding distant as she provided insurance information and answered intake questions that seemed both routine and ominous. Dr. Sarah Mitchell appeared younger than Eleanor had expected, perhaps in her early 30s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and an efficiency of movement that suggested confidence beyond her years. She reminded Eleanor painfully of her own daughter, Sarah, who was currently working as a pediatric nurse in Denver, blissfully unaware that her mother was facing a medical mystery that had stumped a doctor with 4 decades of experience. "Mrs. Patterson, I've spoken with Dr. Peterson about your case, Doctor," Mitchell began, settling into a chair across from the examination table where Eleanor perched nervously. "He sent over your medical history, and I understand you've discovered a mass that's been changing over the past few weeks." Eleanor nodded, unconsciously touching the spot on her neck. "It started after I had the flu, but it's been getting more active lately. This morning it felt like something was moving inside it." Dr. Mitchell's examination was thorough and gentle, her fingers probing the mass with scientific precision while her face remained carefully neutral. Eleanor found herself studying the young doctor's expressions, searching for clues about what those skilled hands were discovering. When Dr. Mitchell's eyebrows drew together in concentration, Eleanor felt her stomach tighten with anticipation. "Mrs. Patterson, I'm going to be honest with you," Dr. Mitchell said, settling back in her chair. What I'm feeling is unusual enough that I'd like to bring in my attending physician for a second opinion. Dr. James Harrison has been practicing here for 25 years, and if anyone has encountered something similar, it would be him. The wait for Dr. Harrison felt endless, though the clock on the examination room wall indicated only 15 minutes had passed. Frank had been allowed to join Eleanor, and he sat in the visitor's chair with his hands folded tightly in his lap, occasionally reaching over to squeeze Eleanor's knee in reassurance. They spoke in whispers about mundane topics, what to have for dinner, whether Michael would call tonight, when they should schedule the gutters to be cleaned, but both of them were thinking about more frightening possibilities. Dr. Harrison entered the room with the bearing of someone accustomed to being consulted about difficult cases. He was a tall, distinguished man in his late 50s whose graying temples and steady demeanor radiated the kind of medical authority that patients found reassuring. Eleanor liked him immediately, recognizing something of Frank's calm competence in the older physician's manner. "Mrs. Patterson, Dr. Mitchell has briefed me on your situation," Dr. Harrison said, washing his hands at the small sink before approaching the examination table. "I'd like to conduct my own assessment, if you don't mind." His examination was more extensive than Dr. Mitchell's, his experienced hands exploring not just the mass itself, but the surrounding tissue, checking lymph nodes throughout Eleanor's neck and under her arms. Eleanor found herself holding her breath during the process, watching his face for any telltale changes in expression. When Dr. Harrison finally stepped back, his expression was one of professional concern mixed with what looked like genuine puzzlement. "Mrs. Patterson, I need to ask you some questions about your medical history, particularly relating to your birth and early childhood." The questions that followed seemed oddly specific and strangely personal. Had Eleanor's mother experienced any complications during pregnancy? Were there any unusual circumstances surrounding her birth? Had she ever felt as though something was missing or incomplete about herself? Did she have any unexplained medical issues as a child? Eleanor answered as thoroughly as she could, though many of the details were lost to time and her parents' early death. She found herself sharing things she had never discussed with anyone, including Frank. The persistent feeling throughout her childhood that she was somehow incomplete, as though part of her was missing. The strange dreams she'd had as a young woman of having a sister who looked exactly like her. The inexplicable sadness that sometimes overcame her during family gatherings, as though she were mourning someone she had never known. "Frank, you mentioned that Eleanor often seemed to be listening to someone who wasn't there when you first started dating," Dr. Harrison noted, reviewing the notes Dr. Mitchell had been taking during their conversation. Frank nodded slowly. "I always thought it was just Eleanor being thoughtful, the way she'd pause in the middle of conversation sometimes, like she was considering advice from someone else. I found it endearing, to be honest. Still do." Dr. Harrison and Dr. Mitchell exchanged a look that Eleanor couldn't interpret, but it sent a chill down her spine. Whatever they were thinking, it was significant enough to warrant immediate action. "Mrs. Patterson, we need to do some imaging studies right away," Dr. Harrison announced. "I'm ordering an ultrasound first, then likely a CT scan, and possibly an MRI. What we're dealing with appears to be more complex than a simple cyst or swollen lymph node." The ultrasound was Eleanor's first direct glimpse into the mystery that her body had been harboring. The technician, a middle-aged woman named Patricia, who had been conducting ultrasounds for 15 years, maintained professional composure while moving the wand across Eleanor's neck, but Eleanor could see her eyes widening as images appeared on the monitor screen. "Is that normal?" Eleanor asked, trying to interpret the swirling gray and white patterns on the screen. Patricia's training kicked in with the standard response. "The doctor will review these images and discuss the results with you." But her voice carried an undertone that suggested she had never seen anything quite like what was appearing on her equipment. Frank held Eleanor's hand throughout the procedure, both of them staring at the monitor as though they could decode its secrets through sheer willpower. The mass was clearly visible as a dark shape surrounded by lighter tissue, but there were other structures within it that seemed to move independently of Eleanor's breathing or heartbeat. The CT scan required Eleanor to lie motionless on a narrow table while machinery rotated around her, taking cross-sectional images of her neck and upper chest. The process felt impersonal and frightening, reducing her to a series of digital slices that would be analyzed by experts who didn't know her as a kindergarten teacher, a devoted wife, or a grandmother who made the world's best chocolate chip cookies. Between procedures, Eleanor and Frank found themselves in a hospital cafeteria that smelled of industrial coffee and institutional food. Neither of them had much appetite, but they sat across from each other at a small table, holding hands and trying to maintain normalcy while their world tilted on its axis. "Remember when Michael broke his arm when he was 8? Eleanor said suddenly, gripping Frank's hand tighter. "How we sat in this same cafeteria, waiting for news about whether he'd need surgery?" "I remember you were more worried than he was," Frank replied, managing a small smile. "You kept saying it was your fault for letting him climb that oak tree. I feel like that now, somehow responsible for whatever this is, like I should have noticed it sooner or done something different." Eleanor's voice cracked slightly as the fear she'd been suppressing began to surface. Frank reached across the table to cup her face in his weathered hands. "Eleanor, Marie Patterson, you listen to me. Whatever this is, however it turns out, it's not your fault. You are the strongest, most caring woman I've ever known, and we're going to get through this together." The call to return for results came sooner than expected. Dr. Harrison and Dr. Mitchell were waiting in a private consultation room, their expressions serious but not hopeless. Eleanor noticed that Dr. Harrison had called in a third physician, Dr. Patricia Williams, who was introduced as the head of unusual cases and developmental medicine. "Mrs. Patterson," Dr. Harrison began, "we've reviewed your imaging studies, and we have some preliminary findings that we need to discuss with you and your husband." Eleanor felt Frank's hand tighten around hers as they prepared to hear news that would change everything they thought they knew about her body, her health, and quite possibly her entire identity. The late afternoon sun slanted through the consultation room windows, casting long shadows across the table where medical reports and scan images lay waiting to reveal secrets that had been hidden for 62 years. "What we've discovered," Dr. Williams said gently, "is going to require some explanation, and it's going to sound almost impossible to believe." The consultation room fell silent except for the distant hum of hospital machinery and the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock that seemed to count down to a revelation that would reshape everything Eleanor thought she knew about herself. Dr. Williams spread the scan images across the table like pieces of a puzzle that had taken 62 years to solve, each black and white photograph revealing structures that defied conventional medical understanding. "Mrs. Patterson," Dr. Williams began, her voice carrying the careful weight of someone about to deliver news that would sound impossible, "what we've discovered inside the mass is not a tumor or a cyst. It appears to be what we call a parasitic twin, essentially the remains of what would have been your identical twin sister." Eleanor felt the words hit her like a physical blow, each syllable rearranging her understanding of her own body, her own life. Frank's hand gripped hers so tightly that she could feel his wedding ring pressing into her palm, grounding her to the present moment as her mind struggled to process the impossibility of what she was hearing. "That's not possible," Frank said, his voice hoarse with disbelief. "Eleanor would have known. Her parents would have known. Doctors would have noticed something during pregnancy or birth." Dr. Harrison leaned forward, pointing to specific areas on the CT scan images. "In cases of parasitic twins, One twin begins to develop normally, while the other becomes incorporated into the body of the surviving twin very early in fetal development. It's extraordinarily rare, perhaps one in every million births, and often goes undetected for decades because the incorporated twin can remain dormant. Eleanor stared at the images, trying to comprehend the shapes and shadows that represented a sister she had never known existed. The scans revealed what appeared to be partially formed structures, fragments of bones, tissue masses, and what looked disturbingly like miniature organs that had been nourished by Eleanor's own body for more than 6 decades. "You're telling me," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible, "that I've been carrying my twin sister inside me my entire life?" "What we're seeing suggests that your twin, let's call her Emma since that's your middle name, never developed beyond the early stages of fetal growth but remained alive in a dormant state within your body," Dr. Williams explained gently. "Your recent illness may have triggered some kind of growth or movement that brought her presence to your attention for the first time." The room spun slightly as Eleanor tried to absorb this information. Memories flooded back with sudden, startling clarity. The persistent loneliness she had felt as a child despite being surrounded by loving parents. The strange dreams of having an identical sister who shared her thoughts and feelings. The inexplicable sense of incompleteness that had shadowed her throughout her life, even during her happiest moments. "The movement you've been feeling," Dr. Mitchell added, "appears to be Emma responding to changes in your body's chemistry and circulation. It's as though your recent illness awakened something that had been dormant, causing her to become more active within the tissue that surrounds her." Frank stood abruptly, pacing to the window and staring out at the parking lot where their truck sat waiting to take them home to a life that would never be the same. How is this possible? How does someone live with another person inside them for 62 years without knowing? Parasitic twins often remain completely asymptomatic, Dr. Harrison explained. The host body adapts and compensates, providing nourishment and protection to the incorporated twin without the conscious awareness of the host. In Eleanor's case, Emma appears to have been positioned in such a way that she didn't interfere with normal bodily functions or cause noticeable symptoms until recently. Eleanor found herself thinking about all the times throughout her life when she had felt an inexplicable connection to children who seemed lost or alone, her fierce, protective instincts toward her students, her uncanny ability to sense when someone needed comfort, even when they hadn't expressed their distress. Had those instincts been enhanced by carrying Emma, by some mystical twin connection that transcended normal understanding? "What does this mean for Eleanor's health?" Frank asked, returning to sit beside his wife, his protective instincts overriding his shock. "Is Emma dangerous? Does she need to be removed?" Doctor Williams consulted the medical report spread across the table. "That's what we need to determine. Emma appears to have her own circulatory connection to Eleanor's system, which means she's been sharing Eleanor's nutrients and oxygen all these years. The fact that she's become more active suggests some kind of developmental change that we don't fully understand." Eleanor felt a strange mix of wonder and terror as she contemplated the sister she had unknowingly carried through every major moment of her life. Emma had been with her during her wedding to Frank, present but hidden during the births of their 3 children, a silent witness to 40 years of marriage, teaching careers, family celebrations, and quiet, everyday moments that made up a lifetime. "I want to see her," Eleanor said suddenly, surprising herself with the intensity of her desire. "I want to understand what she looks like, who she might have been." The doctors exchanged glances that suggested this was not an unusual request but a complicated one to fulfill. "Mrs. Patterson, we need to discuss the medical realities of your situation," Dr. Williams said gently. "Emma's increased activity could potentially pose risks to your health." We're seeing some pressure on surrounding blood vessels and nerve pathways that could become problematic if her growth continues. You're talking about surgery, Frank said, his voice flat with understanding. We're talking about options, Dr. Harrison corrected. This is an extremely rare case, and we want to consult with specialists from around the country before making any recommendations. What's most important right now is monitoring Eleanor's condition and ensuring that Emma's activity doesn't compromise her health. Eleanor closed her eyes and pressed her hand to her neck, feeling the gentle movement beneath her palm with new understanding. This wasn't a foreign invader or a medical anomaly to be feared. This was Emma, her twin sister, who had shared every breath, every heartbeat, every moment of Eleanor's life from before birth. "She's been with me through everything," Eleanor murmured, tears beginning to flow down her cheeks. "Every time I felt lonely as a child, every time I thought I was missing something, she was there. When Mama and Daddy died, when I was struggling through those first years of teaching, when the children were born, Emma was there." Frank moved his chair closer, wrapping his arms around Eleanor as she wept for a sister she had never known she had, mourning 6 decades of missed conversations, shared experiences that could have been acknowledged, and a relationship that had existed in the deepest, most hidden spaces of her body. "What happens now?" Frank asked over Eleanor's head, his voice thick with emotion. "Now we monitor, we research, and we make decisions as a family," Dr. Williams replied. "Eleanor, you're going to need to stay in the hospital for observation while we determine how Emma's activity is affecting your overall health. We'll consult with specialists in developmental medicine, genetics, and surgical oncology to understand all of our options." As the immediate shock began to wear off, Eleanor found herself thinking about her grandchildren, about how to explain to a 4-year-old that Grandma had been carrying Aunt Emma inside her body for longer than anyone in the family had been alive. She thought about her students, past and present, and wondered if her unique perspective as someone who had literally never been alone might have contributed to her ability to reach children who felt isolated or different. "Will I be able to talk to her?" Eleanor asked quietly. "Will I be able to let Emma know that I understand she's there, that I'm grateful she stayed with me all these years?" The doctors couldn't answer that question, but they promised to explore every possibility for helping Eleanor connect with the sister she was just beginning to know. As evening approached and hospital staff prepared to admit Eleanor for observation, she found herself looking forward to the night ahead, not with fear, but with curiosity about what it might feel like to consciously share her dreams with Emma for the first time in their 62 years together. The hospital room assigned to Eleanor felt sterile and impersonal, a stark contrast to the warmth of the home she and Frank had built together over 4 decades. As evening settled over Nashville, casting long shadows through the narrow window, Eleanor found herself lying in the adjustable bed, acutely aware of every sensation in her neck where Emma resided. Frank had arranged to spend the night in the uncomfortable reclining chair beside her bed, despite Eleanor's protests that he should go home and rest properly. The medical team's plan was to monitor Eleanor overnight for any changes in Emma's activity level or any complications that might arise from increased movement within the parasitic twin. Nurses checked on Eleanor every 2 hours, taking vital signs and asking about pain levels, pressure sensations, or any new developments in the mass on her neck. Each examination felt like an intrusion into a deeply personal experience that Eleanor was still struggling to understand. Dr. Williams had ordered additional consultations with specialists from Vanderbilt University Medical Center, including a geneticist who specialized in developmental anomalies, and a surgeon who had experience with the handful of parasitic twin cases documented in medical literature. The rarity of Eleanor's condition meant that every decision would need to be carefully considered, with input from experts who had devoted their careers to understanding the mysteries of human development. As the night progressed, Eleanor became increasingly aware of Emma's presence in ways that transcended the physical sensations she had been experiencing. Lying quietly in the darkened hospital room, she found herself thinking about all the moments throughout her life when she had felt an inexplicable connection to something beyond herself. Times when she had made decisions based on instincts that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her conscious mind. "Frank," she whispered around midnight when she was certain he was still awake despite his closed eyes. "Do you remember when Sarah was born, how I insisted the doctors check her again because something felt wrong, even though all the tests looked normal?" Frank opened his eyes and turned toward her, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the monitoring equipment. "They found that heart murmur on the second examination, the one they missed initially. You probably saved her life by insisting they look again. And when Michael was applying to colleges, how I knew without any logical reason that he shouldn't accept the scholarship to that school in California, even though it was a better financial offer. The engineering program there was discontinued 2 years later," Frank remembered. "He would have had to transfer anyway, probably would have lost academic credits in the process." Eleanor pressed her hand gently to her neck, feeling Emma's subtle movement beneath her palm. What if that wasn't just maternal instinct? What if Emma was helping me make those decisions, providing some kind of guidance that I couldn't consciously recognize? The possibilities seemed both beautiful and heartbreaking. The idea that she had never truly been alone, but that she had also never been able to acknowledge or thank the sister who had been with her through every joy and sorrow. Eleanor found herself mentally reviewing 6 decades of her life, searching for other moments when she might have been receiving Emma's influence without realizing it. Around 2 in the morning, Eleanor experienced what could only be described as a crisis. The gentle movement in her neck became more pronounced, almost urgent, and she felt a sensation unlike anything she had experienced before. It was as though Emma was trying to communicate something important, pressing against the boundaries of her confined space with desperate intensity. "Nurse!" Frank called out, immediately alert to Eleanor's distress. "Something's happening!" The night nurse, an experienced woman named Carol, who had worked the overnight shift for 15 years, arrived quickly and began assessing Eleanor's condition. Her blood pressure had spiked, her heart rate was elevated, and the mass on her neck appeared visibly larger and more active than it had been during earlier examinations. Dr. Mitchell was called in from home, arriving at the hospital in jeans and a hastily thrown-on sweater, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail that made her look even younger than her 34 years. Her examination revealed that Emma's increased activity was causing pressure on surrounding blood vessels and potentially compromising circulation to Eleanor's brain. "We need to consider emergency intervention," Dr. Mitchell told Frank and Eleanor as dawn light began filtering through the hospital room window. "Emma's activity level has increased dramatically overnight, and if this continues, it could pose serious risks to Eleanor's health." Eleanor felt a crushing weight of sorrow settle over her as she realized that meeting Emma might also mean losing her. After 6 decades of unknowing companionship, the cruel irony was that conscious awareness of her twin sister's presence might necessitate separation that could only be achieved through surgery. "Is there any way to calm her down without surgery?" Eleanor asked, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Any way to let her know that I understand she's there, that I'm grateful for all the years she's been with me?" Dr. Mitchell's expression softened with compassion. "Mrs. Patterson, I want you to try something that might sound unusual. Talk to Emma directly. Tell her what you're feeling, what you want her to know." Sometimes in cases like this, emotional communication can have physiological effects that we don't fully understand. Eleanor felt self-conscious at first, speaking aloud to the sister she couldn't see, but as she began to share her thoughts and feelings, she noticed that Emma's agitation seemed to decrease. She told Emma about their childhood, about the loneliness she had felt that now made perfect sense, about the dreams she'd had of having a twin sister who understood her completely. "I'm sorry I didn't know you were there," Eleanor whispered, her hand pressed gently to her neck. "I'm sorry you've been alone all these years while I was living my life without recognizing that you were part of it. I want you to know that every good thing that happened to me, you were part of it too. Every time I helped a child who was struggling, every time I comforted someone who was sad, maybe that was your compassion working through me." Frank watched this extraordinary conversation between sisters with tears in his eyes, understanding that he was witnessing something that transcended medical science or conventional understanding. As Eleanor continued talking to Emma, the monitoring equipment showed a gradual return to normal vital signs, and the visible activity in the neck mass began to subside. Dr. Williams arrived early that morning to find Eleanor resting peacefully for the first time since her admission, with Emma's presence calm and stable. The overnight crisis had passed, but it had also demonstrated that Emma's condition was more dynamic and potentially dangerous than anyone had initially realized. "Mrs. Patterson," Dr. Williams said gently, "we need to make some decisions about how to proceed. The specialists I've consulted agree that Emma's increased activity could pose ongoing risks to your health, but they also acknowledge that this is uncharted medical territory." Eleanor looked at Frank, seeing in his eyes the same conflict she was feeling, the desire to protect the miraculous discovery of Emma's presence, balanced against the practical need to safeguard Eleanor's health and future. After 40 years of marriage, they could communicate entire conversations through glances, and she saw in his expression that he would support whatever decision she felt was right. "What are our options?" Eleanor asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Surgery to remove Emma would eliminate the risks to your health, but it would also mean ending a relationship that has existed for your entire life," Dr. Williams explained. "Alternatively, we could continue monitoring and try to manage Emma's activity medically, but that approach carries ongoing risks that could become life-threatening." Eleanor closed her eyes and felt Emma's gentle presence, a subtle movement that seemed to pulse in rhythm with her own heartbeat. After 62 years of unknowing companionship, she now faced the most difficult decision of her life, whether to preserve her own health by saying goodbye to the sister she had just discovered, or to accept the risks of maintaining a relationship that existed beyond the boundaries of conventional understanding. As morning sunlight filled the hospital room, Eleanor knew that whatever choice she made would change not only her own life, but also the lives of everyone who loved her, marking the end of one kind of sisterhood and potentially the beginning of another. The decision to proceed with surgery came after 3 agonizing days of consultations, medical evaluations, and soul-searching conversations between Eleanor and Frank that stretched deep into the night hours. Emma's activity had stabilized somewhat following Eleanor's emotional communication with her, but the medical team remained concerned about the long-term risks of allowing the parasitic twin to remain in place. Dr. Williams had consulted with specialists from Johns Hopkins, Mayo Clinic, and Stanford, all of whom agreed that surgical removal was the safest course of action for Eleanor's continued health. On the morning of October 18th, Eleanor woke before dawn in her hospital bed, acutely aware that this would be her last day carrying Emma within her body. The surgery was scheduled for 8 o'clock, giving her time to make peace with a decision that felt simultaneously necessary and heartbreaking. Frank had spent the night in the reclining chair beside her bed, and she could see the exhaustion etched in the lines around his eyes, the weight of worry that had settled on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. "I keep thinking about all the times I felt like something was missing," Eleanor whispered to Frank as the first light of dawn crept through the hospital room window. "Now I understand what it was. It wasn't that something was missing. It was that someone was there all along, and I couldn't acknowledge her presence." Frank reached for her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that had comforted them both through 4 decades of marriage. maybe this surgery isn't really about losing Emma," he said thoughtfully. "Maybe it's about setting her free to be remembered properly instead of hidden away." Dr. Sarah Mitchell arrived early to conduct pre-operative examinations and review the surgical plan with Eleanor and Frank. The procedure would be performed by Dr. Patricia Williams, with assistance from a team of specialists including a vascular surgeon and a neurological consultant to ensure that the delicate network of blood vessels and nerves in Eleanor's neck remained intact during Emma's removal. The surgery should take approximately 4 hours, Dr. Mitchell explained, reviewing the detailed imaging studies that had been conducted over the past few days. Dr. Williams will make a small incision along your neck, carefully separate Emma from the surrounding tissue, and remove her while preserving all of your normal anatomical structures. The risk of complications is relatively low, but as with any surgery, there are some concerns we need to discuss. Eleanor found herself only half listening to the medical details, her attention focused instead on the gentle movement she could feel in her neck as Emma seemed to respond to the sound of voices discussing her fate. It was as though her twin sister understood what was about to happen and was saying her own quiet goodbye to the body that had sheltered and nourished her for 62 years. The most unexpected development came when Dr. Williams arrived to discuss the surgical findings with Eleanor's family. Michael, Sarah, and David had all arrived at the hospital the previous evening, along with Eleanor's daughter-in-law, Jennifer, and her eldest grandson, 16-year-old Matthew, who had driven up from school in Knoxville to be present for his grandmother's surgery. "Mrs. Patterson," Dr. Williams began, settling into a chair beside Eleanor's bed, "during our final imaging study yesterday, we discovered something that's going to sound quite remarkable. Emma appears to have been holding something within her tissue, something that we believe may have significant personal meaning for your family." Eleanor's heart began beating faster as she tried to imagine what Emma might have preserved throughout their shared lifetime. "What kind of something?" "It appears to be a small piece of jewelry, possibly a locket or pendant. Our imaging suggests it's been incorporated into Emma's tissue structure, almost as though she's been protecting it. We won't know for certain what it is until after the surgical removal, but I wanted you to be prepared for this discovery." Frank's eyes widened as a memory surfaced. "Eleanor, do you remember your grandmother's locket? The one your mother said disappeared when you were about 2 years old?" Eleanor felt a chill run through her body as she recalled the story her mother had told her about a small gold locket that had belonged to Eleanor's grandmother, a family heirloom that had vanished mysteriously when Eleanor was a toddler. Her mother had searched everywhere for the locket, which contained a tiny photograph of Eleanor's grandfather who had died in World War II, but it had never been found. "You think Emma has been carrying grandmother's locket all these years?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's certainly possible," Dr. Williams replied. "In cases of parasitic twins, it's not unusual for the incorporated twin to preserve objects or tissue from very early in development. If Emma somehow came into contact with the locket during your infancy, she could have incorporated it into her own tissue structure." The implications of this discovery overwhelmed Eleanor with a mixture of wonder and grief. If Emma had indeed been protecting their grandmother's locket for 6 decades, it suggested a level of consciousness and purpose that transcended medical understanding. Emma hadn't simply been a developmental anomaly. She had been a guardian, preserving family history and keeping precious memories safe until the moment when Eleanor would be ready to receive them. As the time for surgery approached, Eleanor made an unusual request. She asked to speak privately with Emma one final time to thank her twin sister for a lifetime of silent companionship and protection. The medical team agreed to give Eleanor a few minutes alone, recognizing that this farewell was as much a spiritual experience as a medical procedure. "Emma," Eleanor whispered, her hand pressed gently to her neck. "I don't know if you can understand me, but I want you to know how grateful I am that you stayed with me all these years. Every time I felt lonely, every time I thought I was facing something alone, you were there. Every time I helped a child who was scared or comforted someone who was hurting, maybe that was your love, working through me. Eleanor felt a subtle movement beneath her palm, as though Emma was responding to her words. I'm going to miss carrying you with me, but I understand that you need to be free now. If you've been keeping grandmother's locket safe for me, thank you for that too. Thank you for being my secret sister, my guardian angel, my other half that I never knew I had. The preoperative medication began taking effect as Eleanor was wheeled toward the operating room, making her feel drowsy and detached from the bustle of activity around her. Frank walked beside the gurney as far as the surgical suite doors, squeezing her hand and promising to be waiting when she woke up. "Tell Emma I'm proud of her," Frank said, leaning down to kiss Eleanor's forehead. "Tell her thank you from all of us for taking such good care of you all these years." As anesthesia claimed her consciousness, Eleanor's last coherent thought was a prayer of gratitude for the sister she was about to lose and anticipation for the reunion with family history that Emma had preserved through decades of silent devotion. She drifted into unconsciousness with the strange comfort of knowing that she was not facing this transition alone. Emma would be with her through every moment of the surgery, just as she had been present for every significant moment of Eleanor's life. The surgical team worked with meticulous care, documenting every step of Emma's removal for the medical literature while treating the parasitic twin with the respect due to someone who had lived in her own way for more than 6 decades. When Dr. Williams finally separated Emma from Eleanor's tissue, the operating room fell silent with reverence for the tiny, perfectly formed figure who had shared Eleanor's life journey from before birth. And there, nestled within Emma's delicate tissue, was indeed a small gold locket, tarnished with age but intact, containing a photograph of a young soldier who had died in a war that ended before Eleanor was born. Emma had kept the family's memories safe through 6 decades of hidden existence, waiting for the moment when Eleanor would be strong enough to receive this final gift from a sister she had never known she loved. As Eleanor began to emerge from anesthesia hours later, she carried within her not only the physical relief of successful surgery, but also the spiritual knowledge that love exists in forms we never imagine, and that the bonds between sisters can transcend the boundaries of consciousness, time, and even death itself. Eleanor's first conscious sensation after surgery was the absence, not pain, though there was some of that, but rather the profound stillness where Emma's gentle movement had been a constant, unrecognized presence for 62 years. As awareness gradually returned in the recovery room, Eleanor found herself instinctively pressing her hand to the bandaged area of her neck, searching for the familiar sensation that was no longer there. Frank's face appeared above her as the anesthesia fog began to lift, his eyes red-rimmed from exhaustion and emotion, but brightened by relief at seeing her awake. "How do you feel, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice hoarse from hours of waiting and worry. "Empty," Eleanor whispered honestly, then immediately felt guilty for the admission. Not in a bad way exactly, but like something fundamental has changed. Is that normal? Dr. Williams approached the bedside with the gentle demeanor she had maintained throughout this extraordinary case. "Mrs. Patterson, what you're experiencing is completely understandable. Your body is adjusting to the absence of something that has been part of your physiology for your entire life. The sensation of emptiness should diminish as you heal." But Eleanor wasn't just referring to the physical absence. As the hours passed and she became more alert, she began to realize that something profound had shifted in her consciousness as well. The subtle sense of inner dialogue that had accompanied her through life's major decisions The feeling of having access to wisdom that seemed to come from beyond her own experience, the inexplicable intuitions that had guided her through motherhood and teaching, all of it felt muted now, as though a voice she had never consciously heard had finally gone silent. "Dr. Williams," Eleanor said during one of the physician's evening check-ins, "you mentioned that you found something during the surgery. The locket?" Dr. Williams' expression softened with something approaching wonder. "Mrs. Patterson, what we discovered is quite remarkable. Emma had indeed preserved a small gold locket, and inside it we found a photograph of a young man in a World War II military uniform. There's also an inscription on the back of the locket that reads, 'For my darling Eleanor, with all my love, Grandpa James.'" Eleanor's breath caught as the full significance of this discovery settled over her. Her grandfather James had died in France in 1944, 2 years before her birth. The locket had been her grandmother's most treasured possession, a final gift from her husband before he shipped overseas. Eleanor's mother had inherited it and had planned to pass it down to Eleanor when she came of age, but it had mysteriously vanished when Eleanor was just a toddler. "Emma kept it safe for me," Eleanor murmured, tears flowing freely down her cheeks. "She held on to Grandpa's love for 60 years, waiting for the right moment to give it back to our family." Frank took her hand as Dr. Williams placed the restored locket on Eleanor's bedside table. Despite its 6 decades hidden within Emma's tissue, the locket had been perfectly preserved, as though Emma's body had served as a protective sanctuary for this precious family heirloom. The gold had darkened with age, but the photograph inside remained clear, showing a young man with kind eyes who shared Eleanor's gentle smile. Over the following days, as Eleanor's physical recovery progressed smoothly, her family began to understand the broader implications of Emma's presence in their lives. Michael brought his laptop to the hospital and helped Eleanor research the medical literature on parasitic twins, discovering that cases like hers were so rare that her experience would likely be studied by medical professionals for years to come. "Mom," Sarah said during one of her daily video calls from Denver, "I've been thinking about all those times when I was growing up when you seemed to know things about us kids that we hadn't told you. Remember when I was having trouble with that bully in 5th grade, and you knew something was wrong before I ever said anything?" Eleanor nodded, remembering how she had felt an inexplicable urgency to check on Sarah at school that day, arriving just in time to intervene in a situation that could have escalated dangerously. "I always thought it was just maternal instinct." "What if it was more than that?" David suggested from his spot in the visitor's chair. "What if Emma was helping you take care of all of us?" The possibility that Emma's presence had enhanced Eleanor's nurturing abilities, her teaching effectiveness, and her capacity for understanding children's unspoken needs added layers of meaning to the loss Eleanor was experiencing. She began to understand that her grief wasn't just for the sister she had never known she had, but also for a part of herself that had been shaped by Emma's silent influence. Dr. Mitchell stopped by on Eleanor's final day in the hospital with news that would provide some comfort for the difficult transition ahead. "Mrs. Patterson, we've been contacted by the Smithsonian Institution. They're interested in documenting your case for their medical history collection, not as a curiosity, but as an example of the mysterious ways that human development can create connections we don't fully understand." Eleanor considered this request carefully. The idea of sharing Emma's story felt both honoring and exposing, but she realized that other families might benefit from understanding that unusual medical conditions could sometimes represent love rather than pathology. "I'd like to think about it," Eleanor replied. "But if sharing Emma's story could help other people understand that love exists in forms we never imagine, then maybe that's what she would want." The discharge process brought its own emotional challenges. Walking out of Mercy General Hospital felt like leaving Emma behind in a way that Eleanor hadn't anticipated. The surgical removal had been successful, and Emma's remains had been treated with the dignity appropriate for someone who had lived in her own way for more than 6 decades. At Eleanor's request, a small memorial service had been held in the hospital chapel, attended by the family and the medical team who had come to understand that they had witnessed something extraordinary. Frank drove slowly on the way home, taking the long route through their neighborhood so that Eleanor could reacquaint herself with the world from her new perspective as someone who was, for the first time in her life, truly singular. The familiar streets looked the same, but Eleanor felt different. Not diminished exactly, but changed in ways she was still discovering. Their home welcomed them with the comfort of 40 years of shared memories. But Eleanor found herself noticing details she had never paid attention to before. The way afternoon light fell across the kitchen table where she and Frank had made countless decisions together. The photographs lining the hallway that documented their children's growth and their own aging. The garden visible through the living room window where she had taught each of her grandchildren to plant seeds and tend growing things. "It's going to take time to adjust," Frank said that evening, as they sat together on their front porch, watching neighbors return home from work and children play in yards where Eleanor had once taught their parents. "But maybe this is a new beginning rather than just an ending." Eleanor fingered the restored locket that now hung around her neck, feeling the weight of her grandfather's love and Emma's protection combined in one small piece of gold. "I think you're right," she said softly. "Emma gave me 62 years of companionship I didn't even know I was receiving. Now I have the rest of my life to live consciously in gratitude for that gift." As stars began to appear in the October sky above Nashville, Eleanor felt something she had never experienced before. Complete solitude accompanied by complete peace. Emma's presence was gone, but her influence would continue through every act of kindness Eleanor had learned, every child she had nurtured, every moment of love she had shared. The sister she had never known she had would live on through the person Eleanor had become while carrying her. And that legacy felt like the most beautiful gift imaginable. Eleanor's story teaches us that love often exists in forms we never recognize until life reveals its hidden gifts. For 62 years, she carried her twin sister Emma without knowing, yet Emma's presence shaped every compassionate decision, every intuitive moment of care, every time Eleanor reached out to comfort a frightened child or support a struggling family. How many of us have felt that inexplicable sense of guidance during life's most challenging moments, that inner voice that seemed wiser than our own experience? Perhaps we're never as alone as we think. In our marriages of 30, 40, or 50 years, in the children we've raised and the grandchildren who fill our hearts, in the careers that gave our lives meaning, maybe we've been accompanied by invisible sources of strength we've yet to acknowledge. Emma's greatest gift wasn't just the locket she preserved, but the reminder that the love surrounding us transcends what we can see or understand. At this stage of our lives, when we're learning to appreciate the precious time remaining, Eleanor's discovery invites us to recognize the mysterious ways love has guided our journey and continues to bless our days. Share your thoughts. Have you ever felt an unexplained presence or guidance during a difficult moment in your life? What hidden sources of strength have you discovered in your golden years? Please leave a comment below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. The 3 months following Eleanor's surgery unfolded like the gentle turning of autumn leaves, each day bringing small discoveries about who she was without Emma's silent presence. The physical healing progressed smoothly, leaving only a thin scar on her neck that served as a tangible reminder of the sister she had carried for 62 years. But the emotional and spiritual adjustments proved more complex, requiring Eleanor to relearn aspects of herself that had been shaped by Emma's unconscious influence. Frank noticed the changes first, subtle shifts in Eleanor's responses to everyday situations that had become second nature over their 4 decades together. Her morning coffee routine, once marked by brief pauses where she seemed to be listening to internal guidance, became more straightforward and decisive. The intuitive moments that had made her such an exceptional teacher, her ability to sense which child needed extra attention or comfort, required more conscious effort now, as though she was learning to trust her own judgment without the mysterious backup system she had never known she possessed. "It's like learning to walk again," Eleanor confided to Frank during one of their evening conversations on the front porch. The November air crisp enough to require sweaters but still mild enough for their traditional end-of-day ritual. "Not physically but emotionally. I keep waiting for that feeling of inner confirmation when I make decisions, that sense that someone else was weighing in on my choices." Frank reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining in the gesture that had anchored them through every major transition of their marriage. "Maybe Emma was never making the decisions for you, sweetheart. Maybe she was just amplifying the wisdom that was already there. The kindness, the intuition, the love. That's all you, Eleanor. It always has been." The adjustment period brought unexpected gifts alongside the challenges. Eleanor discovered a new kind of clarity in her thought processes, a streamlined decision-making ability that felt both foreign and liberating. Without the subtle inner dialogue she had never consciously recognized, she found herself trusting her first instincts more readily, acting with a confidence that surprised her family and friends. Michael visited more frequently during Eleanor's recovery, often bringing his teenage children to spend afternoons with their grandmother. During one such visit, 16-year-old Matthew asked a question that stopped Eleanor in her tracks. "Grandma, do you miss Aunt Emma?" Eleanor considered the question carefully, recognizing its depth despite Matthew's young age. "I miss knowing she's with me," she replied honestly. "But I don't feel like I've lost her, exactly. I feel like she completed her mission. She kept me company when I needed it most, protected our family's memories, and helped me become the person I was meant to be. Now it's my turn to carry that forward." The community response to Eleanor's story had been overwhelming in its warmth and support. Word had spread through their Bellevue neighborhood about the medical miracle that had unfolded at Mercy General, and Eleanor found herself approached regularly by neighbors, former students, and even strangers who had heard about Emma's remarkable preservation of the family locket. Rather than feeling invaded by the attention, Eleanor began to understand that sharing her experience was itself a form of ministry, offering hope to people facing their own mysterious challenges. Dr. Williams had kept her promise to document Eleanor's case for medical literature, but she had done so with sensitivity to the spiritual dimensions of the experience. The resulting research paper, published in the Journal of Developmental Medicine, became one of the most widely circulated case studies in the field, not just for its medical significance, but for its exploration of the ways that unusual conditions can represent forms of love rather than pathology. Eleanor agreed to speak at a medical conference in December, sharing her perspective as the patient rather than allowing only the clinical details to tell Emma's story. Her presentation, titled "The Sister I Never Knew I Had, A Patient's Perspective on Parasitic Twin Syndrome," brought many in the audience to tears and fundamentally changed how medical professionals approached similar cases. Emma wasn't a condition to be cured, Eleanor told the assembled doctors, nurses, and medical students. She was a person who lived a full life in her own way, contributing to our family's well-being in ways we're only beginning to understand. When we approach unusual medical situations, I hope we can remember to ask not just, how do we fix this, but what might this teach us about love, resilience, and the mysterious ways that life finds expression? The holiday season brought its own emotional complexities as Eleanor navigated familiar traditions from her new perspective as someone who was, for the first time, truly singular. Christmas preparations felt different, not diminished, but requiring conscious attention to rituals that had once felt guided by instincts she now understood had been shared. Frank surprised Eleanor on Christmas morning with a specially commissioned jewelry box designed to hold her grandmother's locket alongside new pieces that would document this chapter of their family story. The craftsman had incorporated a small plaque that read, "In memory of Emma Patterson, beloved sister and guardian of family treasures, 1961 to 2023. I wanted you to have a place to keep Emma's memory alive alongside the locket she protected," Frank explained as Eleanor examined the beautiful walnut box with tears in her eyes. "She may not be with you physically anymore, but her love is part of our family's story forever." Eleanor's return to her volunteer work at the local library's literacy program provided another dimension of healing and adjustment. Working with adult learners who were developing reading skills later in life, she found new appreciation for the courage required to acquire abilities that others took for granted. Her experience with Emma had taught her about hidden forms of intelligence and strength, making her an even more effective advocate for students who learned differently or faced unusual challenges. Mrs. Patterson understands that everyone has their own way of processing information, observed Janet Coleman, the program coordinator. She's always been intuitive about teaching, but since her surgery, she seems to have developed an even deeper appreciation for the different ways that people navigate learning and growth. As winter gave way to spring, Eleanor began planning a garden that would honor Emma's memory while celebrating the life they were building in her absence. She chose plants that would bloom in succession throughout the growing season, ensuring that something would always be flowering in Emma's designated corner of the yard. Frank built a small bench where Eleanor could sit and remember her sister while watching the seasons change. The anniversary of Emma's surgical removal approached with a mixture of sadness and gratitude that Eleanor had learned to accept as the complex emotional legacy of her extraordinary experience. She planned to mark the day not as a loss, but as a celebration of the 62 years they had shared and the ongoing influence of Emma's love on their family's story. As she sat in her garden on a warm April evening, wearing her grandfather's locket and surrounded by the first blooms of Emma's memorial flowers, Eleanor felt a profound sense of completeness that was different from anything she had experienced while carrying her twin sister. This was the wholeness that comes from understanding rather than unconscious companionship, from gratitude rather than unrecognized blessing. Emma's greatest gift had been teaching Eleanor that love transcends the boundaries of consciousness, time, and even death, a lesson that would guide her through whatever years remained ahead.